Though visual novels are deeply rooted in Japanese media, nowadays even Western developers have started to release commercial VNs, taking them decades to do so slightly seriously. That wasn't quite the case for some developers established in Asian countries outside of Japan, releasing VNs as early as the late 90s. Such is the case of Atrilim Media, founded by the South Korean writer MOONZERO. What's notable about this developer is that, despite starting as a Korean brand, it eventually shifted into the Japanese market, spawning a new company called CDPA. I wouldn't blame you if you haven't heard of them, as they released only 3 games, none of which gained that much attention. Nevertheless, their titles are well worth discussing, since not only do they offer very idiosyncratic stories, but even the circumstances surrounding their development are quite compelling. For example, their first game, Aoi Namida, is one of the very rare visual novels to ever be ported to the Xbox, as in the original Xbox, not the 360. Even though this video won't be about that game, I will reference it frequently since, due to the distinctive style of this writer, there aren't that many appropriate examples for comparison. I considered making a dedicated video, but since I finished it a couple of years ago, I sort of forgot the little details. Whoopsie daisy. At any rate, the game that we will be looking at today was their final release before the writer essentially moved on from this medium to focus on manga and light novels. Hey there, this is Marin, and this is my review of Silhouette. The game begins with a flashback scene that takes us back to an old, hazy memory of the protagonist's early childhood. Having lost his parents when he was a child, Kousuke briefly escapes the orphanage where he lives. During his flight, he encounters a mysterious young girl who gives him the warm encouragement he greatly needs. Since that moment, he has cherished this precious yet vague memory, deeply wishing to meet that girl once again. Kousuke now lives with his older sister, Kousuke, and attends a prestigious private school where he is known for his cold-hearted demeanor. One day, while running an errand, he unexpectedly runs into a friend of his who promptly introduces him to Maya, a girl renowned as the school's idol, admired by both boys and girls alike. However, that reputation means little to Kousuke, as the first thing that came to his mind was her striking resemblance to the silhouette of that girl from his memory. Time goes by, and Valentine's Day arrives. Out of the blue, Maya approaches Kousuke and gives him a box of handmade chocolate. This perplexes him, as they barely know each other. After some thought, he decides to return the chocolate, feeling unable to reciprocate her feelings. As expected, Maya is hurt by his actions and punches him right in the gut. Then, after being convinced by a couple of his friends, Kousuke apologizes to Maya and tries to make amends. She accepts his apology on the condition that they become friends from that point on. Hold on, you might be thinking, this plot is as generic as it gets. And you'd be right, but that's how this developer works. The main selling point of CDPA's visual novels lies in their ability to subvert the reader's expectations, where their stories start formulaic and of rather shoddy quality, but eventually turn into something much more complex. This is partly why I wanted to use Aoi Namida as a point of comparison. If I were to describe Aoi Namida with a few words, it would be Orotsuba meets Plato's Cave. What I mean is that it's a story with multiple interconnected narrative layers. However, you wouldn't guess this from the beginning, as the first few hours are, frankly, quite mediocre. These are stories that make you waddle through hours of dullness just to reach their narrative highs. And I'm fully aware it's not the greatest selling catchphrase. In this regard, Aoi Namida has a certain advantage over Silhouette, as the boring sections take only 4 to 5 hours to complete, whereas Silhouette's common route can drag on for at least 10 hours. The problem with Silhouette's common route is that it's filled with meaningless slice-of-life scenes. Now, I want to make clear that I'm not completely opposed to slice of life in general, nor do I consider it a primary cause of poor pacing. Seeing how the characters interact and understanding their group dynamics is primordial for a well-rounded narrative development. The issue is that those scenes need to bring something relevant to the plot. It could be seeing a personality quirk of one character, or introducing a hint of something that could eventually develop into a conflict between the characters. At any rate, While silhouette scenes do feature such ideas, it often feels like they could have been shortened or compiled into fewer scenes. I don't want to say they were completely terrible, since they had a cozy vibe to them, but at times it felt like a test of patience. Before diving into the individual routes, there's an interesting aspect of the overall narrative that I'd like to briefly mention: its treatment of the passage of time. The story spans several months, often skipping periods where little in the characters' lives happen. I think this makes the story feel more grounded and allows character development to unfold naturally, as they are given time to process their experiences, even if it's not explicitly shown. This approach has some ramifications in the visual department, but I will address that in the presentation section of this video. As for the routes, there's 6 of them, which can be divided into 2 groups based on their relevance to the actual true plot. 3 of these routes are completely unrelated to the events that happen following the main revelation. Compared to Aoi Namida, I think this is a slight downgrade, since in that game, due to how the narrative was designed, every route had a connection with the central storyline, providing a more cohesive experience overall. On the other hand, some of Silhouette's routes did stand on their own as fairly solid stories. Others did not. Such is the case of Asuna's route. She's the homeroom and physics teacher of Kousuke. Her route felt like an agglomeration of all the weakest aspects of this game. The drama came across as pointless and petty, the protagonist's actions were frustrating, and, in retrospect, Asuna's behavior didn't make much sense when thinking about other characters' routes. I just wanted to mention this route first because, to be honest, I believe it's entirely skippable. In fact, I would simply recommend doing so. The other 2 routes from this half fared better. For instance, Yuko's scenario was honestly quite amusing. She's a classmate of Kousuke, but her circumstances are rather unique. Unlike her classmates, Yuko is a widowed housewife with a teenage daughter. While this premise is undeniably outlandish, I think the game makes good use of it. I found the dynamics between Yuko and Asuna, the homeroom teacher, to be amusing, because despite being a student, Yuko is actually older than her. This route also didn't overstay its welcome and was overall well-paced, although you kind of need to suspend your disbelief regarding the whole age shenanigans. To quote the wise Ku, "Fiction desu." Yui's route is the other one that isn't directly tied to the center plot, yet it surprisingly felt like one of the more developed routes of the whole game. She is Kousuke's senior and a close friend. Her main trait is that she works as a maid for a powerful figure, though this ultimately ended up being largely irrelevant during her storyline. Instead, her route mostly focused primarily on the group dynamic and the love triangle between Kousuke, Maya, and Yui. I was impressed by how well realized this aspect was, although by the end, the route did feel slightly longer than necessary. Still a solid route, though. This brings us to the routes that focus on the main side of the story. It's honestly hard to discuss this part without delving into spoiler territory, since the way the plot unfolds is deeply tied to a major plot twist that occurs during Maya's route. Interestingly, Maya's route serves as a bridge to this section of the narrative, with Kasumi's and Reimi's routes being incorporated in a semi-ladder structure. Before the plot twist, Maya's route feels rather generic, but once the truth is revealed, it recontextualizes all of the story in a seriously impressive manner. It creatively subverts typical genre tropes and ties that narrative subversion with the main thematic these routes explore. While having clear themes isn't anything new in this genre, what makes Silhouette stand out is how it compels you to find out the answer. Unlike your average plot where the game's themes ask you something extremely trivial like, is love more important than social status? Or something similar where you already know the answer beforehand, Silhouette presents a morally gray dilemma that is deeply thought-provoking. On the other hand, Kasumi and Reimi's routes are both focused on recontextualizing the story through backstory. Kasumi, Kousuke's sister, was really well written, with a more realistic character depiction than one that could have followed the usual one-san tropes. Her route also had a lot of potential, but I feel some plot developments were slightly rushed, especially those regarding the romantic relationship between the two. That being said, her ending hit really hard. Reimi's route was another highlight for me. She is Kousuke's classmate, and while she is initially portrayed as an emotionless character, her story showed a warmer and contrasting facet of hers. Her route did a good job at guiding the reader towards the final truth of the story. One thing that I want to mention is that there's a subplot happening in the background, which feels like it will become relevant later on, but it never does, almost giving the impression that the game simply forgot about it. Also, the protagonist can be a bit of a moron at times. Not the worst I've ever seen, but you kind of need to put up with it a little bit. Regarding the quality of the writing, it's honestly not that great. As mentioned in the introduction of this video, MOONZERO, the scenario writer, is Korean, and it did show. I'm not entirely sure if he wrote it in Korean, and it was later translated to Japanese, or if he himself wrote it in Japanese, and it was then proofread by a Japanese native. Either way, the end result is not exactly elegant. There were some sentences and word choices here and there that felt slightly off. He also sure loved using the word silhouette quite often, and while I appreciate a good title drop as much as anyone, it frequently felt somewhat forced. Also, I found amusing how in the options menu, the icon for returning to the title said, "To be title." Not to the title, to be title. I thought it was kind of charming, to be honest. Before talking about the presentation, I have to warn you that this game barely runs, or at least it sure gave me quite the fight. Every time I wanted to play it, I had to uninstall it and reinstall it. Otherwise, it wouldn't even bother to start. Oddly enough, Aoi Namita, despite being older, behaves much better on modern computers than Silhouette, although it too has its own technical quirks. Also, the game lacks some basic functions, such as, for example, the ability to skip previously read text. As far as its visuals, it admittedly looks a bit rough, although the issue doesn't entirely lie in its individual components, but rather in how they work with each other. I found the backgrounds to look quite nice. The usage of color to represent the different seasons led to some rather atmospheric situations. The sprites were varied and with plenty of expressions. In a similar fashion to the backgrounds, I particularly liked how characters changed their wardrobe to suit the season, although this resulted in some characters looking clearly different, and in some cases better, depending on their clothing. However, what makes this game look slightly amateurish is that the backgrounds and the sprites don't match that well stylistically. This visual unbalance is often seen in low-budget VNs, where the developers outsource the backgrounds and place their sprites on top of them without worrying about the overall visual cohesion. In the case of Silhouette, I found it odd since, according to the credits, it seems like the backgrounds were drawn in-house. The CGs, on the other hand, while plentiful, were also slightly underwhelming. Dutch angles are often used in this medium, but I got the impression all shared the exact same angle. Couple that with the often uninspired compositions, and it all resulted in some CGs that didn't quite convey the emotion behind the scenes. One final gripe with the visuals is that I don't think they kept in mind the script when designing the text box. More often than not, you would see lines being split into two, but often the second line would just be one or two characters. The audio department also falls short. It's worth mentioning that none of CDPA's games feature voice acting, with the sole and odd exception of Aoi Namita's Xbox port. The music, while serviceable, is not exactly memorable either. Needless to say, the presentation of this game is on the weaker side, and it's something you need to be able to endure if you want to check it out. Silhouette is not an easy recommendation. It's a game that presents plenty of hurdles the reader must overcome to reach the actual interesting bits. It doesn't look great, it lacks any sort of voice acting, and its common route is dull and uninspired. But there's something about this developer that none other can replicate. It has that sort of unhinged vision you see in this medium from time to time, with a narrative approach that is as intriguing as it is, at times, head-scratching. The twist this game hides is honestly brilliant, both recontextualizing everything up until that point and presenting a unique and provocative question to the reader. It's by no means a visual novel everyone can enjoy, but for those seeking something familiar yet unconventional, this one is worth a look. I give Silhouette a 7.5 out of 10. And that's going to be it for the review. Out of the two, I think I would recommend Aoi Namita over Silhouette, but I believe both have their own merits. They often go on sale for 500 yen on Fansa, although you will have to deal with the god-awful buddy DRM. Honestly, in the case of Aoi Namita, It's probably better to simply emulate the Xbox version, since that way you will have voice acting. I looked up on YouTube out of curiosity to see if anyone had uploaded any footage to see what those voices sounded like. But in the only videos I could find, the players were constantly skipping the text. Pretty annoying. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Mirin out.